Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Southeast Asia, an attack on the high seas. In Washington, a congressional resolution. In Mississippi, a grim discovery. Ranger 7 sends pictures of the moon. President Johnson speaks out on Vietnam. And Giants manager Alvin Dark is on the defensive. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Most of the time, brakes stop cars. Sometimes, trees stop cars. And too often, other cars stop cars. So wrap your family inside the margin of safety only seatbelts provide. Get seatbelts now. And buckle up for safety.
In Washington today, U.S. House and Senate committees approved a joint resolution authorizing military action President Johnson may take against communist aggression in Southeast Asia. The resolution is due for final passage tomorrow, less than 48 hours after its submission on Capitol Hill. In the Senate, only Wayne Morse, Democrat of Oregon, and Ernest Gruening, Democrat of Alaska, said they would vote against the measure. The House, as of this broadcast, unanimously favors the resolution. The current crisis in Vietnam began 4 days ago, August 2nd, when 3 North Vietnamese PT boats fired torpedoes and shells at the Maddox, a U.S. destroyer about 30 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. The Pentagon said the Maddox had been on a routine patrol when the unprovoked attack took place. The Maddox and 4 U.S. aircraft fired back, damaged the PT boats, and drove them off without sustaining casualties or damage. President Johnson was informed immediately, and he met with top officials at a White House meeting on Sunday. The following day, Senator Hubert Humphrey, said to be the president's top choice for vice president, appeared on CBS TV's Face the Nation. He had just attended a State Department briefing about the attack on the Maddox.
Well, what I learned has been very accurately reported in the press and through the news services, namely that one of our destroyers that was cruising in international waters, and I want to underscore that, in the international waters of Tonkin Bay, 25 or 30 miles off the coastline, was attacked by PT boats. Those PT boats seemed to be North Vietnamese. Our Navy defended itself in this unprovoked attack and did it in a very admirable and creditable manner.
Humphrey was asked if he thought U.S. combat troops would be sent to South Vietnam.
No, I really do not. I think that we ought to keep in mind that there is a degree of political instability in South Vietnam, which is rather inevitable in light of the developments there the past year. And from time to time, there will be spokesmen from South Vietnam in an effort to bolster their own people's morale that may be making statements that upset us a bit. This isn't uncommon. You know, there are occasionally instances within the United States when spokesmen make statements for local consumption that upset people in other parts of the world. We're going through some of that right now.
Later that day, President Johnson issued new orders to naval patrols and sent a second destroyer, the Turner Joy, to join the Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson's new instructions were to retaliate against any force which commenced an attack, quote, with the objective of not only driving off the force, but destroying it, unquote. On Tuesday, Hanoi Radio made its first comment on Sunday's incident, stating, quote, "Our boats came into action to protect our territorial waters and our people, and to chase the enemy ship out of our waters," unquote. The statement said the U.S. was trying to cover up its aggression with a story of a so-called unprovoked attack by North Vietnam. That evening, the crisis deepened as the Pentagon announced that North Vietnamese PT boats had made a second attack that day on the Maddox and the Turner Joy. Both destroyers and aircraft were said to have fired on the vessels, drove them off, and sank at least one of them. On Tuesday evening, North Vietnam said the report of a second attack on U.S. ships was a quote-unquote fabrication. Shortly after 11:30 that night, President Johnson made a televised speech to the nation.
Repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense, but with positive reply. That reply is being given as I speak to you tonight. air action is now in execution against gunboats and certain supporting facilities in North Vietnam, which have been used in these hostile operations.
The president said the U.S. response to the attacks would be appropriate and limited.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage. Yet our response for the present will be limited and fitting. We Americans know, although others appear to forget, the risk of spreading conflict. We still seek no wider war.
Before going on television, Johnson read his statement over the telephone to Senator Barry Goldwater, the Republican presidential nominee who was vacationing in California. Goldwater later issued a statement which said, quote, "I am sure that every American will subscribe to the action outlined in the president's statement. It is the only thing he can do under the circumstances. We cannot allow the American flag to be shot at anywhere on earth if we are to retain our respect and prestige," unquote. On Tuesday night into yesterday morning, U.S. aircraft bombed North Vietnamese bases, naval craft, and an oil storage depot in a 5-hour raid along 100 miles of coast. Just before noon, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara held a Pentagon news conference.
In retaliation for this unprovoked attack on the high seas, our forces have struck the bases used by the North Vietnamese patrol craft. During the night, 64 attack sorties were launched from the U.S. carriers Ticonderoga and Constellation against 4 North Vietnamese patrol bases and certain support facilities associated with those bases. In addition to the damage to the torpedo boat bases and to their support facilities, approximately 25 of the boats were damaged or destroyed. 2 of our aircraft were lost, 2 of our aircraft were damaged. All others have been recovered safely on the carriers. The destroyers Maddox and Turner Joy, which have been operating on routine patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, have resumed their patrol operations in international waters.
He then listed moves underway to bolster U.S. forces in the Pacific.
An attack carrier group has been transferred from the First Fleet on the Pacific coast to the Western Pacific. Secondly, interceptor and fighter bomber aircraft have been moved into South Vietnam. Thirdly, fighter bomber aircraft have been moved into Thailand. Fourthly, interceptor and fighter bomber squadrons have been transferred from the United States into advanced bases in the Pacific. Fifthly, an anti-submarine task force group has been moved into the South China Sea. And finally, selected Army and Marine forces have been alerted and readied for movement.
Finally, McNamara declared that unless the U.S. was further provoked, no new American attacks were planned.
Whether this is all that is necessary depends entirely on the actions of the North Vietnamese. The airstrike very clearly made clear to the North Vietnamese our intention to maintain our right to operate on the high seas. That was the objective. I think that has been accomplished.
Yesterday afternoon, President Johnson addressed the crisis in a speech at Syracuse University.
The Gulf of Tonkin may be distant, but none can be detached about what has happened there. Deliberate, willful, and systematic aggression has unmasked its face to the entire world. The world must never forget that aggression unchallenged is aggression unleashed. We of the United States have not forgotten. That is why we have answered this aggression with action.
Finally, to friends and adversaries alike, the president addressed his closing words.
Let no friend needlessly fear, and no foe vainly hope that this is a nation divided in this election year. Our free elections, our full and free debate are America's strength, not America's weakness. We are one nation, united and indivisible. And united and indivisible we shall remain.
The president's declaration of American unity was dramatized on the spot by New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a Republican, who stepped up and shook the president's hand after he'd finished speaking. This afternoon, Secretary McNamara held a second press conference at the Pentagon. He was asked if there was any information to indicate that the Chinese communists had assisted the North Vietnamese in responding to U.S. attacks.
No, I have no information that the Communist Chinese in any way assisted the North Vietnamese in their attacks on our vessels. I think it probable that the Communist Chinese will introduce some combat aircraft into North Vietnam in support of them. As I told you before, North Vietnam does not possess any combat aircraft of its own.
Finally, he was asked to confirm reports that the North Vietnamese were holding Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr., a 26-year-old pilot, in captivity.
There is some indication that if they hold one of our pilots, it is he. We believe that he bailed out of his aircraft. There was an indication from the automatic beeper attached to a parachute that he did so. He's a captive of war, and we would seek through neutral channels to obtain his release. Whether we are successful in doing so, I don't know, but we're bringing to bear every possible pressure to that end.
The congressional resolution to be voted on tomorrow would authorize President Johnson, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, to use conventional military force in Southeast Asia. Tonight, California Senator Thomas Kuechel, the Republican whip, said overwhelming bipartisan support for the measure meant that, quote, our country stands together in the face of danger, unquote. On Tuesday evening, the bodies of 3 civil rights workers missing since June 21st were found in Mississippi. FBI agents recovered the bodies from a newly erected earthen dam about 6 miles southwest of Philadelphia, Mississippi. The missing men were Michael Schwerner, 24 years old, and Andrew Goodman, 20, both white and both from New York, and 21-year-old James Cheney, a Negro from Meridian, Mississippi. Just after the bodies were discovered, but before they had been officially identified, Mississippi Governor Paul Johnson Jr. said in a statement, quote, if these are the bodies of the 3 civil rights workers who have been missing several weeks, the investigative forces of the state of Mississippi will exert every effort to apprehend those who may have been responsible, unquote. The following day, experts working from dental charts and other evidence confirmed that the bodies were those of the 3 missing men. After the news broke, Dr. Martin Luther King remarked on the grim discovery.
Well, this is certainly a shocking and frightening expression of the sickness of our society and the deep hatred that pervades so much of our society. And I think this reveals that we have in certain sections of our country a barbaric expression that is at points as bad or worse than Hitler's Germany. I think the FBI is to be commended for its persistence in seeking to find out what happened to these men and in discovering the bodies. And I think now it is even more urgent to go all out to discover who perpetrated this dastardly act. For if these persons are not found, it can lead to even darker nights of terror, and it may encourage forces that would engage in such acts of violence and murder.
Tonight, the anguished parents of the 3 young men expressed pride in their son's courage and faith in the cause for which they died. At a press conference given by Andrew Goodman's parents at their Manhattan apartment, Robert Goodman, the father, said, quote, our grief, though personal, belongs to the nation. This tragedy is not private. It is part of the public conscience of our country, unquote. In a sermon delivered this evening, Dr. King expressed similar sentiments.
Tonight I'm concerned about the deeper question. The question facing everybody under the sound of my voice tonight, and every person who lives in this nation, is not so much who killed those young men, but what killed them. Yes. And when we move from the who to the what, in a strange sense, their death involves all of us. Those of us who have been negligent about trying to register and vote participated in that act. Those men who have been silent when they should have been speaking participated in that act. Those who have allowed segregation to thrive and grow and develop participated in that act.
I'll have more news for you after this message.
On October 18th, 1960, speaking in Shamokin, Pennsylvania, when he was running for vice president, Lyndon Johnson said, I don't want some bearded dictator 90 miles off thumbing his nose at us, end quote. Now, to debate Mr. Johnson on this statement, here is Barry Goldwater, who calls him to account for this administration's colossal bungling on Cuba and Castro.
The same bearded dictator is still 90 miles off, thumbing his nose at us. And the Bay of Pigs has left us not a monument to freedom, but a dark blot on our national pride. The United States must provide the leadership which will deal effectively with the problems of Cuba and which will stop the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere.
In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
On Friday, the Ranger 7 space probe transmitted to Earth the first close-up pictures of the moon. Scientists said the pictures not only greatly expanded man's knowledge of the moon, but gave encouragement that the lunar surface was suitable for Project Apollo's manned lunar landings, possibly in 1969. The still pictures were taken and sent in the last 17 minutes before Ranger 7 crashed into an area northwest of the so-called Sea of Clouds. In Pasadena, California that night, a team of space scientists gave a nationally televised press conference after viewing the images. The leader of the team, Dr. Gerard Kuiper, spoke first.
This is a great day for science, and this is a great day for the United States. What has been achieved today is truly remarkable. We have made progress in resolution of lunar detail, not by a factor 10, nor by a factor 100, but by a factor of 1,000.
President Johnson called the mission, quote, a basic step forward in our orderly program to assemble the scientific knowledge necessary for man's trip to the moon. We'll be able to build our lunar landing equipment with greater certainty and knowledge of the conditions which our astronauts will encounter, unquote. At NASA's D.C. headquarters, a jubilant spokesman reported, quote, everybody here is happy as hell, unquote. Sports, right after this.
Tang is not a juice or juice product, but the instant breakfast drink with natural orange flavor. And glass for glass, Tang is more economical than orange juice. Next time, get Tang in the familiar 7-ounce size with a week's supply for a family of 2. And now, in the new, bigger 1-pound, 2-ounce size, a week's supply for a family of 4. Or the new, bigger 1-pound, 11-ounce size, a week's supply for a family of 6. Tang.
Alvin Dark, embattled manager of the San Francisco Giants, held a team meeting yesterday and told his players he judged them by their performance without regard to race or creed. 2 weeks ago, Dark had a long discussion of the Giants with Stan Isaacs, an interviewer from Newsday, a Long Island daily newspaper. At one point, Dark allegedly remarked on the large number of mental lapses made by his team. He reportedly said, quote, we have trouble because we have so many Negro and Spanish-speaking players on this team. They are just not able to perform up to the white ball players when it comes to mental alertness. You can't make most Negro and Spanish players have the pride in their team that you get from white players, unquote. In the days that followed, these statements received wider attention through a radio program on WNBC New York. Dark has stated flatly that he was misquoted by Isaacs. Isaacs, meanwhile, has defended his reporting while at the same time conceding that the topics of race and baseball occurred in separate parts of the conversation and had not been linked by the manager. There is no audio recording of the conversation. Dark received help from an unexpected direction this week when Jackie Robinson, the first man to break baseball's color line, came to his defense. During most of Robinson's career with the Brooklyn Dodgers, Dark was an outstanding shortstop with the Giants, who were then based in New York. This week, Robinson called Dark, quote, a fair-minded man without racial prejudice, unquote, adding, quote, I don't believe he said the things attributed to him. I've known Dark for many years, and my relationship with him, on and off the field, has always been exceptional. I have found him to be a gentleman and, above all, without malice toward Negro players." Unquote. The Giants, for their part, seemed eager to forget the whole thing. This afternoon, shortstop Jose Pagan said, quote, "Dark has always been very nice to me. I have no complaints. Let's just bear down and win the pennant. I think we're going to win it." Unquote. The Giants, idle tonight, trail the National League leading Phillies, who lost to Houston, by a game and a half. In the American League, the first-place Yankees lead the Orioles by 4 percentage points, and the White Sox by a game and a half. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Thursday, August 6th, 1964. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.